Hey everyone, welcome to Subject Shift, where today we'll talk about mental health. I'm your host, Issa Newsome, and today I'm excited to be joined by my sister, Elizabeth Wingfield, a marketing and communication specialist who has her master's in clinical mental health counseling. Today we'll be answering some questions about mental health and how it affects us.
And just to clarify, I'm in pursuit of my master's in clinical mental health counseling, so I'm on track to graduate in 2027.
Okay, cool. So let's start with, what do we do when your mind is overwhelmed? Or what to do when your mind is overwhelmed?
All right, well, to start initially, I think it's important that we look at the cause of why we're overwhelmed, like what that feeling of being overwhelmed stems from. For example, are you overwhelmed because you're stressed, because there's too much going on? Did you not get enough sleep? Is there some sort of conflict going on in your personal life outside of work or school that you're stressing about? So you kind of need to look at what the cause is, because, if it's like too much workload, you have a lot going on, maybe if you're in college, you need to back up how many credit hours you're doing, or spend less time on certain things, or find a way to narrow your focus. Or do you have a maladaptive coping mechanism that's making your mind overwhelmed? For example, are you so stressed out by your school that you're staying up late because you want more free time and you don't want to start the next day and have school again, and so staying up late on your phone, and then you're tired, and then you're worse at doing school, and then you get overwhelmed and overloaded.
And it's just kind of like this spiral.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess, how would you suggest like a step-by-step plan? I guess the first one would definitely be like identifying the root cause of that overwhelm.
Yeah, just pause. Like, as soon as, whenever you feel something, you need to take a sec and think about it on a little deeper level, and take a moment to write out the different causes, because more than likely it's not just one thing, right? There could be multiple things going on, and then from there I would prioritize both your mental health and physical health, because as we'll talk about throughout the episode, it's better to have a holistic picture when it comes to health, because mental health and physical health are so intertwined. So make sure you're doing everything you can in that regard. And then always, for anyone, I would recommend counseling. I think counselors can help with a lot of practical behavioral improvements, and then working out some of those deeper emotional issues that might be subconsciously stressing you out.
Okay, great. And then how does memory work, and like how do you improve that memory?
Okay, so I got this information from Lesley University about about how we store memory. So first of all, something starts out as a sensory input. This says sensory register. So we get something initially, and then from there, there's short-term memory, which a common misconception about memory is that short-term memory is within the past few days or something, and long-term memory is like decades ago. In actuality, short-term memory is almost like instant. There's working short-term memory, and then there's also short-term memory. So those are the two types. So short-term memory, and strictly the definition of it is like, if you see a commercial and it's like, call this number real quick before this offer ends. That would be a good example of short-term memory, right? You're not the next day or the next week, you're probably not going to remember that number, but you can remember it short-term. Working memory is more like when you're working a math problem and you have to keep things in your head in order to manipulate things and to work with them. So how memory works is usually it goes from working memory into long-term memory. And when something goes into long-term memory, there's actually physical neural connections that have to change in order for that to happen.
So I guess, would that be it's more of just practice and repetition to build that like memory up?
To make it into a long-term memory?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I'd say that that's a good way. And then I think so there are two theories about retaining memory and then primarily losing memory. It says there's a theory called decaying and a theory called about interference. So with decaying, it's because something's not repeated that you forget it, and with interference, it's because there's new information that replaces it. Kind of like when you update a new password and it replaces your old one. So it kind of depends on the theory, but I guess if you want to move into some tips of how to also put things in long-term memory, that can help, because there are some things you can do, lifestyle changes, and then there are just some things that you can, ways that you can almost hack your brain. A big one is using mnemonics. So mnemonics are certain memory devices. For example, in classical conversations, a lot of the things you memorize are based off of songs. So songs are a great way to help memorize something, or finding another way to make it memorable or stand out. I find that sometimes making a story out of something can work. Or I find that what also makes something memorable is if it's really humorous or if it involves violence. So if there is a certain, if you want to memorize Latin declensions, for example, or something like that, you can make up a story or make up a song. And again, if you use humor and violence, the brain tends to tag those, right, and you can memorize them a bit better. So those are conscious ways that you can remember something better.
And quick backtrack for the viewer, Classical Conversations is a co-op group for homeschoolers, and a lot of, when you're younger, they kind of go over like basic I guess like forms of geometry, or just like basic multiplication with those songs.
Mm-hmm. History sentences.
Right. Yeah.
Skip counting. All that stuff.
Right.
Yes. And then did you want to go into other tips about memorization?
Yeah.
Okay, so other things that might help you are, for example, don't multitask. Everyone thinks they can do multiple things at once, and they actually can't. You're always sacrificing something when you're paying attention to something else. And then removing distractions in your environment. So if you can listen to maybe wordless music, or not have the TV on, or a lot going on around you so you can focus, that'll help with memory. Time limits, which we kind of talked about breaks. So in another episode, we might address more on breaks, but having time limits can actually help improve memory. And then as far as long-term lifestyle changes, it's the quote-unquote boring things we all hear about, right? Sleep, diet, exercise. And then a really important one I do want to hit on with diet, that's an easy change that anyone can make today, and that's safe for anyone to make, is taking omega-3s. You need about 2 grams a day by supplements, and then fish at least 2 times a week. But there are a lot of studies about omega-3. For example, according to this NIH article, effects of omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids on brain function. They say it improves learning, memory, cognitive well-being, and blood flow to the brain, and actually shows immediate improvement in verbal memory in adults with minor cognitive impairments. In addition, there are a lot of health implications for omega-3. So like I said, this is where there are a lot of things that help you mentally that also help you physically. So they were looking at people who had low rates of omega-3, so that's around 4% or less, and then people with higher rates of omega-3 on the omega-3 index, and that's 8% or higher. And what they found is that people with a higher omega-3 index tended to live about 5 years longer. In addition, they were looking at all-cause mortality, and they compared taking omega-3 supplements and smoking. And they found that people who had a low omega-3 index, who were non-smokers, compared to people who were smokers but had a good omega-3 index, their life expectancy was the same. So in other words, not taking omega-3s is potentially as damaging to your life expectancy as smoking.
Okay, gotcha. We have a few more questions, and they're a bit more about emotional and relational questions. So first, this one really piqued my interest, was why do we express emotions by crying? Because I think most mammals don't, when they cry, it's usually to just get something out of their eye. They usually express like sorrow or sadness in a much different way than us. So why is that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question, because I was looking forward to talking about it, and like you already observed, humans are the only creatures, beings that cry emotionally. The only other things that produce tears are for some sort of, to remove some sort of irritation or for lubrication, but not as a form of emotional expression or coping. So this is very interesting. Charles Darwin actually declared emotional tears, quote unquote, purposeless, because he was saying there's no evolutionary reason for us to have this ability to cry. It really doesn't make sense. So it's definitely a mystery around human beings. So in researching this issue, first of all, I think it's important to realize when we talk about emotions or any of the coping mechanism around emotions is the purpose that emotions have. Have you seen Inside Out 2?
I have, yes.
Yeah. And so I think Inside Out 1 and 2 do a great job of demonstrating the purpose of all emotions, right? Because some emotions go about things the wrong way, but no emotion is inherently a bad thing. No emotion is really even negative. And so in the first movie, if you go back, Joy really has a hard time with sadness and understanding the purpose of sadness and why she's there. And then by the end of the movie, slight spoiler alert, you realize that sadness actually brings Riley connection, right? It brings other people to be around her and to help her because they can see that she needs help, because she's vulnerable, because she's feeling down. And so I think it's important to see the purpose and sadness in that, and in other emotions too, if we end up touching on those. But in researching crying, I looked at two specific studies. So the first study centers around sad movies, right? We've all seen those, right, tear jerkers or the dog dies.
Yeah, literally any dog movie.
Basically. Yeah, so in this study, it's specifically, it was published by the NIH, National Institutes of Health, and it's called Why Crying Does and Sometimes Does Not Seem to Alleviate Mood, a Quasi-Experimental Study. Now, in this study, they had people watch two different sad movies, and they had a group of criers, people who tended to cry and they figured would probably cry, and a group of non-criers. And they assess their emotional state before the movie, immediately after, 20 minutes after, and 90 minutes after. And they had a few findings. The first finding, unsurprisingly, was that more women tended to cry than men. And additionally, women tend to cry more frequently than men. Right. So again, out of the population of criers, most of them are women, and then women also tend to cry more often, more frequently, which again, anecdotally, you could probably figure that out. And then the next thing they found out was very interesting. So they're measuring negative mood on this scale. And so both of them start out, in a similar position before the movie. Both of them have somewhat of a spike right after the movie, but the people who are criers have a bigger spike in negative emotion. So that's immediately after. Okay. And then, like I said, they measure it 20 minutes and 90 minutes. Well, 20 minutes after, there's the inverse of that. There's a huge spike initially, and then there's a huge drop even below the non-criers. So that means their negative mood is lower, so that means they're doing better overall. Got over it quickly. Exactly. So yeah, huge spike and then huge drop to where it's below the non-criers. And then 90 minutes, we see that drop continue where there's even a greater difference between the criers and non-criers in negative affect or negative mood. So this shows that, crying can be a form of expression, but it's also a form of coping, right? I mean, if we look at crying and what it does, according to Healthline, it releases oxytocin and endorphins, which ease physical and emotional pain. And we'll talk a little bit more about oxytocin with connection. But those are both natural pain relievers, which is pretty cool if you think about it. I mean, it's free, it's healthy, you think of all the coping mechanisms people use when they're upset. You think of some people resorting to alcohol or being on social media a lot or just checking out in some other way, and again, crying is perfectly healthy and it's the body's natural way to deal with it. So I just think it's unfortunate that it's kind of put down in our culture like it is, especially for men. And then the second study I wanted to look at, study number 2, it's published in the journal PLOS Biology, and it talks about the results of the findings. Essentially found that in women's tears, there's some sort of pheromone when men smell them. There is. So essentially like a non-scented smell, something.
Right.
And it found that those, I don't want to misquote, but yeah, men experienced reductions in aggression by more than 40%. Yeah.
Well, that's surprising. I'll say at least.
Yeah, well, I guess if you're just crying, have someone sniff your
Right.
tears and it'll help you chill out. No,
I hope not.
But I mean, this also shows that one of the uses of crying is to help other people mirror you, right? To kind of bring everyone down to the same emotional level. So again, part of it is that interaction and that reaction from other people, but part of it's just internal coping for us as people.
Right. Okay. Great. Is there anything else you want to add, or do you want to move to the next question?
Do you have any other questions about crying or this topic?
I do have one, but I think I'll save it for the end because it's a bit different.
Okay.
So the next question is, how do emotional connections to family and friends work? Because another thing, again, kind of with the animals, it's very diverse within like the animal kingdom. You'll have like I believe octopi, they're very solitude creatures, and then you'll have something like wolves that just like they hunt in packs. So kind of what's with humans and how they are with like friends and family?
Yeah, what's with humans? Just out of curiosity, do you think there are some humans who are like pack humans and some that are solitude humans, or what would you say?
So I would say this isn't really research based, so it's definitely more of an opinion. But I know with people they often easily bond with people that are more like them, so more similar.
Right, birds of a feather flock together.
Right. So I think it's very interesting how humans communicate, because even with that, you have like multiple friend groups who are very, very different, and they have friends that are they can be totally polar opposites, but they can still get along very, very easily.
Right. Or something that's always mystified me is that like you can be friends with one person and you guys click so well, and you can be friends with another person and you click so well, but then those two people like cannot stand each other.
Right.
So it's weird how you can have a certain friend triangle where two people in that friend triangle, or one person 2 ways gets along great, but in between the other people,
they just clash. Yeah, that is definitely interesting. I do have to say it's probably a mixture between how you were raised as a child and how you were taught to interact with other people, but also your own personal preference. Because I know personally there's some people I like them, but I won't quite click with them as well as like some of my friends. So I think that's very interesting. Definitely has to do with like personality, how you're raised, and then also maybe culture. And just kind of with that, like even in the US, we're taught just kind of like people within towns, they're much, much more talkative, and they'll be much more friendly, whereas people who are raised in the city will just kind of keep to themselves because that's kind of what they were taught in politeness. So even with that, they might live like state close. They will have completely different experiences with people's and their interaction with them.
Yeah, or we were even talking about the differences regionally between the North and the South.
Right, yeah, how the South can be more aggressive.
Right, there's this culture of Southern hospitality, which actually stems from, a culture of honor and
protecting your
your reputation, and yes.
Yes. So yeah, I would say again, yeah, personal preference is a big thing.
Mm.
Um, and then again, personality and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. Well, I guess I didn't have this in my notes, but I think it's first noting, especially for people from a faith-based background, looking at what the role of human connection is. Because I think a lot of times when you look at the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, I think there's this general idea that you just need God. Like all
right,
you need is God.
right,
God is enough.
right.
And you kind of get this extreme asceticism of people who are hermits living off by themselves, and
right.
you just need to go alone and meditate, which isn't to say there isn't a place for that. But when we look at the role of human connection in the Bible, I think the first example we see of human connection is in Genesis, right?
Right.
You have, first people,
yeah.
Adam and Eve starts right there. And so what you notice is that Adam at some point gets lonely. And so when God sees Adam is lonely, he doesn't say, oh, I think we need more God time, or maybe we need to walk in the garden like 2 or 3 times a day.
Right.
He says, no, he's lonely. I'm going to make him a companion like him, and he makes Eve. So
Okay.
yeah, there's nothing. I know I struggled a lot growing up with a need for connection and feeling guilty because of that need. Because
right.
yeah, I didn't think there was a space for me to have those needs, and I thought if I were a really good Christian, I would just need God. I wouldn't feel like I need to process things with people or have
right.
friends. But that's not true. That's just actually how we're wired, was
right.
to be in community.
Yeah, because I do know people are social creatures.
Mm-hmm. They are.
I definitely know. I do also struggle with just kind of noticing that I do need the connection between someone else.
Yes.
But I do have, what do you think is like, why do you think we have different roles of like friends, family, mentors, and just kind of like what they do for us? So yeah, with like friends and peers, what do you think of that? Like, what is the most beneficial thing with like relationships?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting that you bring up different types of relationships. Some people tend to think it's all or nothing, right? Like you're a party person, you're super outgoing, and I've heard it phrased as like, oh, I would rather have 4 quarters than 100 pennies. And actually, in actuality, I'm sure for most people, it's a mix of the two, right? It's like I have 3 quarters and 25 pennies or something. But you know what I mean? You have, and I think this is best described in relationship circles, right? You have different circles, but then also, like you hinted at, different people fill different roles within those circles. Like you might have someone super close to you who's more of a mentor relationship, and then you might have someone who's like more of a close friend, and then you might have someone who's someone you're more mentoring or helping out in some form or fashion. So yeah, different types of relationships, but they all serve a purpose. And actually, this kind of touches on some of the, I guess, the tips or the practical things that you can apply about connection. This is by Greater Good Magazine, which is a publication by UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. And they said that you actually need both types of relationships. You need strong relationships with really close friends and family. And then also you actually need those weak relationships. And again, this isn't just, this is just like saying hi to your neighbor or saying hi to someone at the grocery store or a coworker, but both are actually very healthy for you to have in a mix. And again, this is jumping ahead to this, but between the two, you should prioritize those stronger relationships and be putting more time and energy into them.
Right. But that doesn't mean just completely only having one.
Exactly. Yeah, they both have a purpose.
Right. Okay. Let me check. I think that's it.
I do have more on connection we can touch on.
I do. Yeah, if you want to go ahead and do that.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we kind of talked about from a biblical standpoint what, the importance of connection, and then what does that look like otherwise? Well, like I hinted at earlier, there's a really deep tie between mental health and physical health, and this is pretty apparent when it comes to connection. So the first thing is talking about like, what is connection? What happens when we feel connected? And this is from a literature review called The Connection Prescription, Using the Power of Social Interactions and the Deep Desire for Connectedness to Empower Health and Wellness by the NIH. And they said that when a newborn starts crying, the mom produces a hormone called oxytocin, which we also touched on earlier. Now, oxytocin is referred to as the bonding hormone. This hormone comes about with actually petting your pets, petting animals, with massaging, with touching, holding hands,
Right.
hugging.
So affection.
Yeah, that physical contact creates this bonding hormone. And then if we look at people with low social interaction, we see that low social interaction is reported to be similar to smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Oh my.
Yeah, I know. Smoking is like the standard for bad health. Basically, it's like do this or else you're the same as like a smoker. But yeah, when you think of that, it's similar to smoking 15 cigarettes a day and to being an alcoholic, and that it's more harmful than not exercising, and it's twice as harmful as obesity.
Oh my.
I know, these are all the things that you're like, bad. But
Right.
how often, we've heard so much messaging about obesity and smoking, and, we'll throw drugs in there. But how often do we hear messaging about really connections and relationships? And so, have you ever inhaled helium?
I have. Yes. Too much at one point.
Yes. Well, then that'll be a great experience to refer to this. But when you inhale helium, it's not the same feeling as holding your breath, right?
Right.
Because what do you feel physically when you're holding your breath?
You just a bit of a built up pressure. You just like a quick.
Yeah.
I mean, usually when you're like holding your breath, you take a quick inhale and you just
Yeah.
hold it for however long you can just hold it.
Right. There's this pressure, like almost a feeling of panic if you wait too long, and then your body like has to breathe at some point. It's like we're done with this. But if you inhale helium, you don't have that same kind of pressure. But what happened to you when you inhaled too much?
Okay. So, some brief context. It was after a bit of a club event, and I was left alone to my devices in elementary school, so no one can blame me. But basically, I exhaled all of my breath, and I took a deep inhale of helium, and I talked. And then I took another inhale. I didn't take any breathers or anything.
Right.
So, it definitely didn't feel like I was holding my breath. It felt more like I couldn't get enough air, and eventually I got really dizzy. So I stopped inhaling helium.
You get lightheaded, right? Because so you kept inhaling the helium because your body did not recognize the need for oxygen, right? Typically your lungs, as there's less and less air or more carbon dioxide buildup, they'll panic and they'll be like, but with helium, it's something that's still filling your lungs and your brain doesn't register, oh yeah, we're suffocating, right? And so I think that's a great analogy for what's happening in our world right now, where you have all of these substitutes for connection, right? You have social media and you have these online friends, and now we're having like virtual reality, and we've had gaming for a while. But it's this false sense of connection where you're filling your lungs with helium, right? Where there's not that panic feeling like, oh no, I need to like go out with my friends like right now. Like instead there's this feeling like, this seems like a lot of effort. And then also there's the feeling of, fear of rejection to like inviting someone out and taking that first step to do something, when it's like, I could just text them or message them on social media and I don't quite have that same level of anxiety. There's not that same level of rejection.
Not as much risk.
Right, not as much risk. So they use that as a substitute, and people feel like they're drowning or suffocating, but they don't realize why, because we have this substitute that's meeting this surface level need, but not this deeper level need. And so, we've seen a lot of issues with a lack of connection, especially since COVID, where there's been increased rates of anxiety and even suicide because people are connection starved, and yet there's this enormous barrier to getting connection, which is ironically this connection substitute.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that presents a lot of challenges now. And then I know you also talked about with connection, there's family and friends.
Right.
Going to family relationships and the importance of that. This is from the book It Didn't Start With You. Highly recommend that book, by the way. It's about the intergenerational transmission of trauma. So how through epigenetics we can pass on like even specific trauma triggers to up to 3 generations later.
Oh.
Yeah, pretty interesting work. But it says 91% of people who had a strained relationship with their mother were diagnosed with a significant health issue. So that's like cancer, coronary artery disease, hypertension, which is like high blood pressure.
Right.
This was compared to 45% of people who had a close relationship with their mom. And then for people who had a strained relationship with their father, 82% of them later had a significant health issue as compared to 50% who later, who had a close relationship with their father who had a significant health issue. Now look at me, right. Don't look at the notes. Right. How many do you think had significant health issues who had a strained relationship with both parents?
Probably like 92%.
It was 100.
Oh my!
100% of people who had strained relationships with both parents later had a significant health issue, as compared to 47. So yeah, it's connection is a real thing. A lot of times people treat mental health like you can't see it, so it's right. not there. But I mean that doesn't make sense.
I don't believe it.
Right, exactly, which I think is just tragic, because there are lots of things we don't see, but that doesn't mean they're not real, right? Like right. You might not see that you've torn a certain tendon or like had a fracture in your bone, but that doesn't mean that they don't have real consequences if they go untreated. And so same thing with connection. It seems like it's this intangible force, but there are very real, physical health benefits as well as, detriments to your physical health and mental health if you neglect this. So kind of moving on to some like what do you have to do, in order right. to reap the benefits of being social, and what do those look like? How can you apply this? Well, it's recommended, again, this is by that article, Greater Good Magazine, that you have 3 to 5 close friends. People who had 3 to 5 close friends had the lowest levels of loneliness, anxiety, depression, and adverse health outcomes, like we talked about with that previous statistic. Ideally, you should get 1 to 3 hours of interaction a day. On average, people get 34 minutes of social interaction a day. Yeah. Well, if you think, again, it's crazy because the vast majority of people are around people all the time. Right. So you're like, what's happening? And it's like, people are around people, but they're disconnecting. And I'm sure, you've probably seen this in social groups or friends, or especially with high schoolers where, you might be with someone, but you guys might be like on your phones or doing 2 completely right. different things. Yeah. So you can be with someone, but still not connecting with them. So people just get stuck in their silos, even at work. And all it takes is, starting a random conversation with a coworker, or, if you're going to school, starting a random conversation with someone at school, or as you're walking to your next class, or over lunch break instead of being on your phone engaging. Or, and again, the onus is on parents for this one, having a family dinner where people put their phones down, where you have to sit all together at the same time and talk to people. That could easily be like well over that 34 minutes, but it's such a low priority for people to actually engage with people that again, that's what it is, when ideally it really should be 1 to 3 hours a day, which right. isn't hard if you prioritize it. Yeah. But a lot of people don't.
Right. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then I did have one more question. We, a bit previous in this episode, we talked about coping mechanisms and like harmful kinds. I was wondering, do you have any ideas for like good ones, or just like healthy coping mechanisms?
Yes. Now I want to clarify, there's I think some coping mechanisms that get a rap for being inherently good or inherently bad, right? Like people are like, don't do drugs, don't do alcohol, don't party, right? Any other number of things.
Right.
And then there are ones that are like, oh, these are good ones.
Right.
healthy,
Eat healthy,
sleep
exercise.
enough, journal, exercise.
Right.
Yes, exactly. And I do think that those are great things to do, but I think that coping mechanisms, if we're not careful, can very easily turn into just emotional suppression. So we talked about emotions earlier, that there are no bad emotions.
Right.
Every single emotion serves a purpose. And the thing about emotional suppression is people like to think, oh yeah, I just like I don't want to be angry right now. I feel bad about being angry.
Right.
Anger's kind of scary, so I'm gonna like shut that one off. Or like, I don't really want to feel sad or hurt right now because that's not a good feeling.
Right.
So I'm gonna turn that off.
Right.
But here's the
like
thing.
Masking.
Yeah, masking it, like just suppressing it, ignoring it,
bottling it up.
Yes, I know. We in Inside Out too. It's like suppressed emotions.
Yeah.
And so I guess in Inside Out too, maybe an unrealistic aspect is they just took those 5 main emotions and suppressed them. But in general, I find that if you suppress one emotion, you suppress all of them.
Right.
Even if you're not aware of it, it's like, it's not like you have individual emotions like here's anger, disgust, sadness, joy, and you're like, turn the anger down a little.
Right.
It's like you have one faucet with all of these. You turn it off, you turn all of it off.
Right.
And that's, again, people a lot of times end up resorting to that, but that's not healthy for you or for anyone, because emotions, like sadness, they all have a purpose. Emotions aren't, I like to compare it to this. Emotions are like a child, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't want them in the front seat driving the car, but you can't stuff them in the trunk either. Would not recommend. But all that to say is it's like that check engine light or something, right? It's like an indicator on your dashboard. It's not to determine exactly what to do. Like, I'm angry right now, so I'm going to tell this person exactly what I think. Right. It's to say, like, hey, pay attention to this. I notice that I'm angry right now. And then you think about the purpose of anger. Anger is a protective emotion. So it's like, what am I trying to protect right now? Anger is also a secondary emotion. So it's like, what does this anger stem from? Am I hurt? Am I sad? Am I afraid of something? Am I struggling for control? So, we just want to keep that in mind, the importance of emotions. And, sometimes, like, in a given moment, you might really be struggling with something, and maybe you're at work, or you're feeling really anxious and you have a presentation coming up, right? Coping mechanisms are important for us to be able to manage our emotions, to function as humans on a day-to-day basis, right? It's not wrong to cry, but if you're crying to the point where you're breaking down like all the time and you can't like go to work or something, then it's like, hey, it's interfering with your functionality as a human at that point. And hurting you in other ways. So we do want, if something happens, or you get an upsetting text from a friend, but you're in a setting where you can't quite process it yet, it's like they can serve a purpose, kind of to take that rough edge off of the emotion. But a lot of people, instead of just taking that rough edge off and processing it later, they use that as a complete substitute for processing. They never get to that part where there's curiosity, where they're like, oh, I wonder why I felt so anxious or so angry.
They don't address it at all.
Exactly. They're just like, I just want to not feel this and move on.
Right.
And, it's like a pipe, and you clog it so much that at a certain point, the pipe is going to burst. And so you can either choose to let emotions out, express them in a healthy way, or you can stuff them all, and there's no such thing as just emotions disappearing. And if you store them, then it's like that pipe where it's going to explode at a time that you can't choose. So either you let it out a little in a healthy way, or the pipe bursts, floods everything everywhere, gets on you and everyone else around you.
Right. So just what I'm getting, just kind of to recap, that was a lot. Basically, healthy coping mechanisms are good, like with proportion, again, to take off the edge. If you're like definitely struggling consistently with a specific emotion, and it's starting to negatively influence like your everyday life. That's kind of to help like your coping mechanism, but not to where the point, not to where you're just keeping it all down, you know, stuffing it in the trunk.
Right, exactly. Yeah, don't stuff them in the trunk. Yeah, so it is good to have some healthy ones in the back of your pocket, right? So again, so if you get angry, your knee-jerk reaction isn't to like, I'm gonna go throw things or yell at people.
Right. I'm gonna take a deep breath and leave.
Exactly. Like have those things, and there are so many great coping mechanisms that I've been learning. I would say some of my favorites are just taking deep breaths. One of my favorites for anxiety is you breathe in and you imagine you're inhaling clean air, and then you breathe out. And then as you breathe out, you visualize breathing out responsibility or stress for whatever is coming up. Excuse me.
Right. So I guess I have a few myself.
Really?
There's definitely, for like example, like for anxiety, I think a lot of people have tendency to struggle with that. But definitely taking the edge off of anxiety, it doesn't help when you're just fully focusing on that one emotion. It kind of helps if you take a deep breath, you look around you, you kind of like just ground yourself in your space, and then you address it from like, hey, this is happening. I'm feeling overwhelmed for A, B, and C reasons. And then taking like precautionary action of I need to leave this space. I'm not feeling good or safe in it, or just taking a deep breath and just figuring out the next steps.
Yeah, just like putting a pause on things, which to kind of get into some relational things, a lot of times when people are in an argument or conflict of some kind, they just get so locked in on fixing the problem or winning the argument, or they're like, we gotta do this right now.
Right, like defensiveness.
Yes, and then that kind of brings out the worst in people, which there's a whole other explanation that we could go into about the brain and why that is, why emotions hijack your brain to the point where you don't have access to your long-term memory, to your ability to use logic and to rationalize, even to your communication skills. So, a lot of times when people are just like, you get in that panic mode where you're just stunned, where there's that fight, flight, or freeze. Either you just shut down or you say some stuff you regret later.
Right.
And so there is so much value. I really want to recommend John Gottman's book, The 7 Principles That Make Marriage Work, because it talks a lot about this concept of being flooded. And so what me and my husband have done in our relationship is the rule is when one of us starts to feel that emotion at all. So this is way before we're getting to the point where one of us says something we regret, we say, I'm flooded. And the rule is you have to take a minimum of a 20-minute break where you're not talking about the issue. We just like play a fail army video, or we do something else to let our emotions regulate back.
Settle.
Yes. So like you said, coping mechanisms are really great for that settling process. And then some coping mechanisms are inherently do involve some sort of processing. For example, something I like to do to process is I write poetry. Or we talked about journaling. Journaling can be a good way to process, or talking to friends. Again, all of those things can turn counterproductive if you're not
it's
careful.
Like too much.
Yeah, if you're handling them in the wrong way and you're not using it as a way to become self-aware. And so one of the best things you can do to process stuff is to get a counselor, someone who's going to help you develop this self-awareness and have it be in this productive setting where they can hold the space for you. Again, there's a place for validating and empathizing. I think some people can get to the point where in an issue that they'll just become like your hype person or your yes person, and they'll be like, oh yeah, you're right, no matter what, they're a jerk. And then sometimes that's not always helpful for self-awareness.
Right. Yeah, so it's kind of this happy medium of you're not victimizing yourself, but you're not completely apathetic towards yourself, and just kind of just being aware again with the self-awareness, and having others, I think, could definitely help. Like, definitely like a trusted friend. Like if you don't have the resources to counseling, I'd say maybe a trusted friend, or just journaling, and then like maybe looking back to that journal entry and just recognizing, hey, this is the reason I felt this. This is the reason this happened. This is the reason I responded like this.
Yes. Yeah, that can definitely help. And then along the lines of having a close friend, I think that can be good if they're emotionally mature. I think if you can also find a safe adult, if you have a good relationship with your parent who is healthy, or, it doesn't have to be, for me, the golden standard will always be a counselor. But even within the counseling profession, there can be terrible counselors.
Yes.
But you can even seek out like a mentor figure. Like if you need someone who's like a little bit removed from your situation, even if your parents are healthy, having that mentor figure can be a great thing because, especially with this particular demographic, at age 16, you actually have all of the mental faculties you need to use logic and to rationalize. So you have the same logical capacity as you will in your 30s or 40s.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I mean, use it wisely. But teenagers are disproportionately affected by emotions and by peer pressure. Okay. And so if you get that mix of a friend in who, again, maybe you're best buds, but they're not the maturest friends sometimes, or you've seen some examples of like, oh, maybe I emotionally wouldn't want to handle it like them, it might be worth thinking like, hey, is there someone who does have that emotional maturity I'm looking to emulate?
Right. Okay. That wraps it up for this episode. If you guys have any questions, feel free to email us at subject.shift24@gmail.com or subscribe on our YouTube channel or on Spotify. I'll see you in the next one.